And I think there are good reasons why this is a good time to reflect. Some of them more obvious than others, but rising youth unemployment. Plainly, as of next, I think it's Wednesday, some very large cuts in public spending looming. Institutions under pressure. And I think perhaps most important of all, and perhaps less appreciated in some quarters, the fact that the analysis of the skills problem that industry education liaison is supposed to be tackling is changing. And it may be that it's a very different problem from the problem that we thought we were tackling 10 or 15 years ago. Okay, well, there are two key underlying themes which will come out in what I'm going to say. I don't want to labour them here because, as I say, they will come out in subsequent slides. But the failure to define what Dennis Gleeson and I once termed the 3 Rs, the rights, roles and responsibilities within our education and training system, it's something that marks the English system out from, say, the German system or indeed the system in most OECD countries, that employers, parents, students, the state are not very clear who is meant to be doing and paying for what, and it's all very fluid. And the second one, which I think is going to become more and more apparent after next Wednesday, an enormous gap between policy aspiration and the actual reality, and between, I think crucially, the bargaining power of employers and the bargaining power of individuals. And I think that the fact that that gap is widening, as Hugh's talk this morning suggested, at least in some parts of the world for some people, is a major problem. Okay, the paper builds on things that I and others have written about in the past. I'd simply flag up Keep 209, which is a Skope working monograph on the incentives to learn, and Keep and James, which is 2 papers, one on incentives to learn at the bottom end of the labour market, and the second one on recruitment and selection practices, because both of them, in a sense, feed into what I'm going to say now. Okay, well, before I get on to the meat of this thing, I want to just flag up very quickly 4 underpinning issues. And there they are. A need to satisfy competing interests, failure, as I've already suggested, about who pays and does what. The idea of national interest in a world of globalised capital, Hugh's point, but I'm going to do it from the point of view of an English policymaker. And the fourth one, education is business now. It's not just, there's not 2 separate worlds, they're blurring. Okay, the first one, I shouldn't have to go into much detail with an audience like this. You all know it, but it needs to be reminded because very often I think policymakers tend to forget it. Win-win-wins can be contrived, but students, employers and wider society do at certain points in time, at certain subjects, have differing needs and requirements and interests. And very often, curiously, education and training institutions land up having to mediate these different demands and interests. And the losers then tend to complain. And sometimes the losers are employers, and sometimes the losers are particular employers. We'll come back to that. Rights, roles and responsibilities. Well, I think there is a huge vagueness and ambiguity, and I do think that we really do need to tackle this. For example, you endlessly get complaints about students not having the required employability skills, team working, business acumen is one that I noticed CIPD reporting recently. Well, that's fine, but what's the best site of learning to learn the team working skills you need in a particular workplace? Well, that workplace would seem to me to be the logical place to learn those skills. So there's an interesting issue about who is meant to be doing what, and because we've never really tried to thrash that out, everything is up for grabs. And although that's great for some players, it's not necessarily great for running the system. British industry means what? I love the Confederation of British Industry for an organisation I once worked for a very long time ago. I mean, it is certainly no longer much to do with industry in the sense of manufacturing, and it's not actually terribly British anymore. Large swathes of what we regard as British industry are actually owned by foreign companies or foreign shareholders. Large swathes of what is left of British companies have the bulk of their activities, turnover, workforce and profits abroad. They have their head office here. And the degree to which anything that they believe about the future is bound up with what happens to the British workforce, the British economy and the British labour market is small. And we as a country have never believed in, or certainly not since Mrs. Thatcher, not believed in national champions. We're not like the French. We're not like the Germans. We do not believe in national champion companies. So there is a real issue around it. And there are just a few employers. That's just a few figures. That's by gross value added. Those are pretty scary figures. So when we talk about the interests of the British economy and the interests of British employers and what happens within that economy and labour market, we do need to bear in mind that that may be a dwindling interest. And also, finally, on the sort of background factors, education as business. Do read the recent report from the CBI on this, which is cited in the paper. More and more of education in future is going to be provided by business for profit. Private training providers have been doing it for donkey's years. Private higher education institutions are the coming thing. Private for-profit state-funded schooling is on the horizon. This is a world in which it will be very difficult at the margins to distinguish business from education, because many educational institutions will be businesses, which will actually give the CBI some enormous problems when they start criticising education. But they haven't got to that stage yet. So I think now is rather a good time to, if you like, step back, reflect and say, well, where are we going? Where do we want to be? And given where we really are going, will it take us to where we want to be? Because I think a lot of the old problems are diminishing, but unfortunately they're being replaced by new problems, many of which I think are even more intractable than the problems we used to think we were tackling. Okay, well the first sort of, the old problems are going away. I suppose in one form or another, and it's a depressing thought, I've been working in this kind of a field, broadly defined, for 30 years, and the skills crisis we used to talk about, well, at least on many conventional measures, you could ask the question, what skills crisis? I think a space alien getting out of his or her spacecraft, looking around the figures that UKCS, the British UK government could give them about skills, employer demand, mismatches, might scratch its head or heads and say, well, where's the problem? You've got a massive rise in higher education, a massive rise in qualification achievement, a massive decline in people with no qualifications. The National Employer Skills Survey suggests that skill shortages are small and limited and often transitory. Employer satisfaction with education and training, again as measured by NES, is fairly uniformly high. There are some problems, but they're not terribly big. And we have a great deal more and better industry education liaison than ever we used to have. So in one sense, you could say, well, so what's the problem? But of course, life isn't like that. People reframe the problems, reinvent a crisis, because we do like to have a crisis to tackle. And therefore, I'm going to suggest at least 3 reasons why the industry education, there's a huge crisis with what education is doing, carries on going. First is competition between sectors. Second is war for talent, which Hugh mentioned this morning. And the third is, I think, some fairly dodgy data. Employers are in competition with one another for various things, particularly talented young people, or in the case of some employers, any young people, because what they offer is not that attractive. There is a problem that those employers who lose out can do one of the 3 things on that slide, and unfortunately, quite a lot of them picked quite a lot have tried number 1. So vast efforts to try and make your career, your sector, your employment, or your job sound more exciting. Particularly through advice and guidance, through producing better careers material, whatever. You seek labour elsewhere, or you offshore. Well, we've certainly been doing a lot of that. But the third, I think, is a particularly unproductive method, which is to basically say, oh, well, it's not our fault, our jobs are really good, it's just that those lousy teachers direct people away from whatever it is we do. And of course, to some extent, the STEM crisis as a broad crisis is partly like that, in the sense that we actually produce a fair number of STEM graduates. It's just that many of them choose, for reasons that I can't begin to imagine, not to work in STEM subjects for STEM employers. They go and work in the city or for large consultancies or do other things.